Hello everyone, Amy R here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and I have a couple cards for you guys using this new CZ design stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. It is called Yay. There was a whole new release this week. I'll have a link to it in my blog post. So I was looking at this set and just thinking about ways to use all these sentiments, and anyone who's watched me for years knows I have a thing for pattern paper. I tend to collect it and hoard it, and I don't usually use it. I used to use it a lot back in the day, but more so now I just collect it. So this time I decided to actually use it. So I pulled out the, the Echo Park Just BU 6x6 pack and decided to create a couple cards using these papers. So I have the papers, and then I also have Simon Says their basic rectangles and their circle wafer die sets as well. And then a couple different colors of Simon Says cardstock so that I can create some fun patterned cards today. So I started off with this stripe pattern that I die cut with one of the basic rectangle dies. And then I'm going to stamp this large holla word onto another of the patterns with some clear embossing ink. And I use my anti-static powder tool first. And then I'm going to ink up the stamp with the clear embossing ink and then stamp it onto the pattern paper. And then I'm going to emboss it with Simon Says Stamp's ultrafine gold embossing powder. So in the video, it's a little bit harder to see the gold embossing properly. I did all this in natural light. I just happened to have good lighting when I filmed this. But I thought the gold looked so pretty with these papers. It just, love. So I covered the stamp sentiment with the embossing powder and then melted that with my heat tool. And for this first card especially, I'm pretty much just flying by the seat of my pants, like fiddling around, trying to figure out what I want to do. You know, I had a vague idea in my head, but nothing, concrete. So I got out my paper trimmer and I trimmed down this large sentiment here. And then as I was doing it, I was like, these would look really cute if I did it as a little banner. So I trimmed off the one end, and then I decided to use the solid side of that same pattern paper to stamp another sentiment. I was going to emboss this one as well, but then changed my mind while I was doing it and decided to just stamp it in Simon Says Intense Black ink. So I'm just using another acrylic block and then the little You Got This stamp. And I'm going to ink that up in the black ink and then stamp that along the bottom of this piece of paper. And then that one I'm also going to trim out with my paper trimmer. And then I decided I needed a third little banner just to, kind of even everything out. So I grabbed this pattern paper from the pack. I used to get asked a lot, like, how do you find which papers to go together, et cetera, et cetera. When I used to use pattern paper a lot back in the day. And honestly, I always would stick to the same pack. I wouldn't switch between brands or use packs from like different papers from different packs, and do that kind of mixing and matching. You can totally, but I find it's just easier to stick with the same one pack of pattern paper because everything coordinates, it's the same color theme, et cetera, and all the patterns, and I just mix and match the patterns within the pack. So I find that's the easiest way to go. So once I had all my little banners cut, I just, you cut a little notch down the center with scissors and then you meet it up with each corner to create a fun little banner. So I had all those cut and now I can start adhering these to that striped pattern paper. So I line everything up on my grid mat just to make sure I've got everything straight and even. And I applied the adhesive just to the right side of all these little banners, and then the actual little like flag ends, I curled up a little bit with my fingers. Just gave it that little extra something. So that little bit of extra texture there. So curled that up. And then with my last one, the little narrow one, I adhered that into place. And then I grabbed my little Tim Holtz tiny attacher and added a little staple to that to make it look like it was stapled on. But I made sure it was adhered as well, just so that everything's in place. And then I trimmed down some Simon Says Soft Navy cardstock to be slightly larger than the pattern paper. And I'm going to adhere that with my ATG adhesive. And then for my little embellishments, I went through my stash and I have these glittery gold enamel dots. They're from Doodlebug and they're the gold assortment shape sprinkles. So those went nicely with this embossing powder. So pulled those out, added a few of those to my card front, and then I'm going to go on and start creating the inside of my card. So I have a huge mess going on here. You can see some of it. I'm not even kidding. I've said this again. I've said this in many videos. I never have more than maybe a foot square space to create in half the time. I have so much stuff piled up on my desk, especially when I'm creating stuff like this, using pattern papers and cardstock and embellishments and everything. I had things falling on the floor. It was a mess, but I was having fun. So got my white card base, which I cut to 4 1/4 by 11 and scored at 5 1/2. So it's a top folding A2 size card. And then I die cut that same kind of pink speckly pattern paper with one of the Simon Says circle dies, and used my anti-static powder tool on that one as well. And then inked up another sentiment from the set with the clear embossing ink, stamped that onto the circle. And I'm going to hold that with some reverse tweezers, and used my gold embossing powder again, holding it with my reverse tweezers so that I don't burn my fingers when I melt this because it's such a small piece. And I'm going to melt that with my heat tool as well. And then I stamped another sentiment onto the remaining little scrap there of the solid color of cardstock. And again, stamped that with the intense black ink. And then that one I trimmed down with my paper trimmer and then cut flag ends on both sides of this one. So just carefully line that up in my paper trimmer. And I always use just the wire down the center to kind of give me a visual as to where exactly this is going to cut. So cut that, trimmed it down, and then trimmed down another couple of the same patterns that I used on the front of the card. And then I'm going to apply all my adhesive, and then this way I can just line everything up and adhere it to the inside of my card. So I'm going to start with my large strip here, run that across the inside of the card, and then I just decided to add that little narrow strip with a stripe just to tie everything together. So adhered that, and then I can adhere that circle sentiment and then apply the other one below it. And then I'm going to flip over the card base so that I can trim off the pieces of paper that were hanging over the outside there. So trim all that off, and then I'm going to adhere the card front with some foam tape, and that finishes off card number 1. So once I had that one done, I was kind of getting it back in the groove of, playing with pattern paper and kind of knowing which ones I really liked together, etc., etc. The second card came together a lot quicker. So I did the same thing, die cut one of the patterns with the basic rectangle dies, and then I die cut this word pattern from the pack with a circle die. And then I'm going to stamp the word yay onto it with the black ink. So made sure to ink it up really, really well, stamp that onto the pattern paper. And then I used my heat tool to just speed up the drying process. I wanted to make sure this was completely dry because I want to emboss the next word basically over this one. So made sure it was really, really dry. And then I was really liberal with my anti-static powder tool. Like, you can see it pretty much changed the color of the stamping and everything. I wanted to completely cover this. And then before stamping anything, I poured over my embossing powder to make sure it wasn't sticking to that word because I didn't want it to cling at all. And then once I was sure that nothing was going to stick to that, I can ink up the next word with my clear embossing ink and then stamp that over top. And then this I'm going to coat with the gold embossing powder and melt that with my heat tool. So if I had got any areas that clung, I could have used a paintbrush to kind of wipe them away. But when I'm like layering sentiments like this, I want to make sure just to save me the time and the grief of having to try to like fix it. I just found it easier to make sure that black stamped sentiment was completely dry first. And then once it was all done, I used a Swiffer cloth to remove all that anti-static powder tool from the pattern paper so that the black still popped again. So I did that, and then I had this little stripe piece was left over from the first card. So it was perfect to stamp this little sentiment on as well, and then do the same thing. Just trimmed off the end, cut the little notches off each side. And there was still adhesive attached to it from adhering it to the inside of the card, so that just worked out perfectly. So I did that, and then I also trimmed down one more pattern paper just to kind of break up kind of the busyness of the triangle pattern as well as that circle pattern. So I adhered that to the triangle background there and trimmed off the little bit that was hanging off the bottom. And then for this like circle piece, I decided to pop that up with foam tape as well. But first I attached my little sentiment banner piece there, and same thing, use my little Tim Holtz tiny attacher just to add that little staple in there. And then I'm going to attach that to the background with foam tape so it's popped up. And then I'm going to add some more of those gold glitter enamel dots after I trim down some of this mint cardstock. So did the same thing, just trim this to be slightly larger than the pattern paper background. I used the second largest basic rectangle die. Yeah. So it's like 3 3/4 by 5 inches, something like that. So I trimmed the cardstock to be about 1/8 of an inch bigger than that piece so that there's just a nice even little border all around it. So then applied my adhesive, applied that to the cardstock, and then I can add a few more of those little gold glitter dots just to finish off this card. So I had to kind of dig through the pile I had made here. It was such a mess. I had cardstock and stamps and dies and everything everywhere. So dug through, found those enamel dots again so I could adhere those to the outside of my card. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the inside of the card. Use some more pattern paper and some more stamps to just finish everything off. So I had this leftover strip of pattern paper that I'd used from the front. So I'm going to stamp the word yes onto this with my clear embossing ink and emboss that with that same gold embossing powder. So got that stamped into place. Pour over my gold embossing powder, and then I'm going to melt that with my heat tool. And like doing the voiceover in this video after I'm editing, what I was thinking leaving that embossing powder container like just sitting open on my desk, I do not know. I've said I don't know how many times I like to put the embossing powder back and put the lid on because I knock everything over, especially because yeah, I make a huge mess and this bugs me. Like, oh, it just bothers me. So anyway, I'm thankfully I didn't end up knocking it over, and you know, when I was done everything, I was able to put the lid back on it. But yeah, melted that with my heat tool, and then I trimmed it down some more with my paper trimmer. And then did the same thing by cutting a little notch down the center, and then you meet each corner with the center with my scissors to create a little flag end. Then I'm going to adhere that to that word patterned paper. And then I had die cut a circle of that mint cardstock with the same circle die. And I'm going to stamp another sentiment with the intense black ink. And then I can adhere this to the inside of my card after I've removed any more of that anti-static powder with my Swiffer cloth. And I'll adhere the little banner strip to the inside of the card, and then I can adhere that circle right below it, and that finished off these cards. It's just fun playing with some pattern paper and some fun sentiment stamps. So like I said, I will have a link to this release because she's got, you know, more than one sentiment set and some fun word dies, all that kind of stuff. So I will have a link to Kathy's newest release, as well as links to all the supplies I used in the description box below the video, as well as on my blog, so you can check that out if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!